The Nanga Parbat disaster revolves around a pair of mountaineers who were attempting to ascend the mountain in the winter for the 7th and 4th time respectively. This duo of mountaineers are known to be Polish climber Tomasz Mackiewicz, 43, and Frenchwoman Elisabeth Revol, 37. And if Tomasz and Elisabeth were successful, they would have been the first to summit the unfinished Messina 2000 route. They would also be the second to summit in winter, and Elisabeth would have been the first woman to do so in winter. Sounds great, right? In January 2018, this expedition team arrived at the foot of the western face of Nanga Parbat. Immediately when they got there, they established their base camp in a bid to prepare for their forthcoming attempt to summit Nanga. One thing remarkable about the mountain was that during the winter climbing season, climbing the mountain was a difficult feat due to the weather. But irrespective of that, the duo were not discarded, as they were no visitors to the incredibly harsh weather conditions that they would face on Nanga Parbat slope, since it was their 7th and 4th time respectively. There was absolutely nothing to panic about. Interestingly, the French mountaineer Elisabeth had previously accompanied Tomasz in his 3 summit attempts. Being acquainted with the alpine style of climbing peculiar to the mountain, the 2 mountaineers had a simple plan. They took their time to get acclimatized by the 24th of January and ascended to their Site 4 camp, which was at 7,800 meters. With that, they prepared to start their final push for the summit. Aware that the final push would not be easy in any way, the duo decided to brave the freezing air temperatures, which were around -40 degrees, and make their way into the mountain's death zone, which was at 8,000 meters towards the summit. It is pertinent to know that the death zone referred to the altitude where the human body can no longer sustain itself for more than a few days, even while resting. This is a result of the sparse oxygen in the air, which can barely sustain human life. In addition to the difficulties compounding the air was Nanga Parbat's notorious foul winter, coupled with the exposed nature of the final stretch of the journey to the summit. These drawbacks imply that the climbers would surely be met with a barrage of high winds and snowfall that constantly battered the slopes of Nanga Parbat during the winter. The 2 mountaineers set off on their journey for the summit in the early morning hours of January the 25th, and later that day, despite the odds against them, the pair reached the summit in triumph, becoming the second expedition to reach the summit of Nanga Parbat in the winter. However, the pair did not have long to relish their achievement, as a powerful storm system was approaching the mountain, causing the weather conditions to become increasingly concerning to the duo. The weather conditions on the mountain only began to further worsen, and the pair of climbers soon found themselves becoming lost in the exposed and freezing conditions as they attempted to make their retreat down the mountain. More issues would further impede the pair, as shortly after beginning their descent, Tomasz informed Elisabeth that he had become snowblind and was unable to see. The alternative was to cling to his partner, which he did. So, with him clinging to Elisabeth's shoulder, the pair continued their slow descent, when unfortunately, Tomasz, who had not worn an oxygen mask due to the hazier conditions earlier in their climb, began to suffer symptoms of serious altitude sickness, as he began to have great difficulties breathing. As night began to fall, the badly frostbitten duo were able to descend to roughly 7,280 meters. Before they found a small crevice, they decided to set up a tent in the crevice and then huddled overnight in the crevice, trying desperately to shelter from the biting wind. But Mackiewicz no longer had the strength to continue the descent, and by sunrise, his condition had deteriorated further. With this situation of things, Elisabeth then decided to send out numerous text messages and radio calls requesting help, and as the hours passed, Tomasz's condition continued to get worse, and he began to exhibit symptoms of potentially fatal late-stage acute altitude sickness, as he had become extremely lethargic and blood streamed from his mouth, which if not managed properly, could lead to death. Luckily, Elisabeth eventually managed to establish contact with the outside world, and the efforts to rescue the pair began on the condition that they need to descend further to an elevation of roughly 6,800 meters. This condition was given due to the extreme altitude which they were currently located and the intense storm condition that struck the mountain so that the dispatched rescuers could reach them. Making that decision to descend the mountain was very difficult for Elisabeth, not just because of the frigid weather condition, but also the fact that she was going to leave her partner behind as he was unable to walk. With no other choice left, she finally decided to attempt this descent zone alone. On the 27th, to point to Tomasz's location when she sees them. She made a huge sacrifice to have left Tomasz, having left most of her supplies, including her sleeping bag, in an effect to keep him warm and give him a chance to live as much as possible. Elisabeth managed to make her way down to an elevation of 6,700 meters by the evening of the 27th. But upon reaching there, she, however, discovered that the rescue party had not yet arrived as expected. This spelt another cold night in the unwavering storm, of which she had no sleeping bag or fire for warmth. How sad! But unknown to Elisabeth, her words of calls for help had reached a pair of climbers who were at the base camp of K2. This pair, Dennis and Adam, were preparing for their upcoming attempt to become the first team to summit the mountain in the winter. Upon receiving the news, the pair of veteran climbers without hesitation offered to attend to the stricken climbers on Nanga Parbat. They were also joined by 2 other members of their K2 expedition. On the morning of the 28th, the storm had still not receded on Nanga Parbat, but the rescue team insisted that a helicopter which had been crowdfunded assist in the rescue of the team to bring them as high as possible, where they could go on with the efforts on foot. The helicopter dropped the 4 men off at an elevation of 4,800 meters. Immediately after, Dennis and Adam began to ascend the mountain to search for the stricken duo Tomasz and Elisabeth, while the other 2 men stayed behind to establish a camp. Against all odds, both Dennis and Adam, not minding the brutally cold and challenging conditions on Nanga Parbat, fought their way through. And nearly at 3 a.m. in the early morning of the 29th, while the pair of rescuers were ascending, they shouted, instructing Elisabeth to proceed to descend further. Their shouts got to Elisabeth, who managed to respond, and that made it easy for them to manage to locate her. The pair of rescuers, as they had expected, found her in a very bad shape, as she began to suffer hallucinations due to the altitude sickness which had caused her to discard one of her shoes sometime during her night in the crevice. It is worth emulating and remarkable to know that Elisabeth, despite being in poor condition, begged the rescuers to continue up the mountain to rescue Tomasz. Unfortunately, the duo of rescuers refused, as the condition on the mountain was fatal, with winds blowing at a constant 50 miles an hour with a wind chill of virtually -80 degrees Fahrenheit. And apart from that, altitude and weather constraints, as they felt Tomasz was probably still on the mountain at around 7,200 meters. In an interview, Dennis said that at the time we had to make a decision, either to help Elisabeth survive or to continue with little hope of finding Tom. We also had a very bad weather forecast for the next few days. It was obvious that we had to stay with Elisabeth, who was in very poor condition, and that's why we decided to focus on her. Both Adam and I are now unable to face Tomasz's rescue. So they went down without Tomasz, and it took Elisabeth and the pair of rescuers roughly a frigid 5-hour walk before they returned to base camp. Getting to the base camp, Elisabeth was airlifted to the hospital for medical treatment. Nonetheless, in the following days, the weather condition on Nanga Parbat did not in any way improve, and any further rescue efforts to locate and retrieve the presumed dead body from the mountain were abandoned. In the effect of the tragedy, the remaining fragment funds had earlier been crowdfunded in their bid to dispatch the helicopter to the mountain, were allotted to Tomasz's widow. The leftover was about 100,000 euros. It is no doubt the wife of Tomasz was beyond devastated by the loss of her husband, but regardless, she consoled herself. She seemed to have found solace in the fact that her husband fulfilled his life ambition. This is evident in the way she outwardly expressed her joy that her husband, before the cold hands of death snatched him away, was at least able to accomplish his long-time goal of reaching the summit of Nanga Parbat in the winter. For her, that was a milestone. The Polish nation has it that Tomasz was the man who will be remembered. Records show that he was a personality to reckon with, as he possessed extraordinary willpower throughout his life, which resulted in him transforming himself from a heroin addict in the 1990s to a man that dared to conquer the killer mountain, Mountain Parbat, in its most bar state, which was during the winter. The French mountaineer Elisabeth, who was rescued in a dramatic nighttime operation on Pakistan's Killer Mountain, felt very hard to bear the idea that no one could help Tomasz. Her weak and bleeding partner, whom she had left behind while descending the peak alone in the darkness, beset by hallucinations which beckoned her to freeze to death. Elisabeth Revol, while speaking from a hospital in France's Haute-Savoie region, where doctors are assessing whether she will require amputations due to frostbite in her hands and left foot, said the rescuers urged her to leave behind Tomasz Mackiewicz, a Polish national. What are your thoughts on this disheartening disaster? Share with us in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more disaster stories about mountaineering. Thanks for watching.